Okay, we are live now.
Okay, so welcome to the second day of the Agri-Food Business Day, this fourth roundtable, which is entitled The Environmental Sustainability of Global Value Chains. Welcome to our panelists and welcome to our viewers. My name is Tetsuo Ushikusa. I'm Deputy Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries of Japan, and I'll be moderating today's fourth round table. I'll be putting 2 rounds of questions to our panelists, after which I'll be opening the floor to questions from viewers. Viewers can send questions to dialogues@WTO.org. I'd like to begin by providing some context for this roundtable. The environmental sustainability of agriculture trade is no doubt a topic of paramount importance. But prior to going into that, I'd like to recall the critical role that international trade plays in feeding the planet and efficiently allocating resources, including natural resources around the globe. International trade in food is not simply a luxury. The movement of food from the parts of our planet that have a food surplus to the parts that have a food deficit is absolutely critical for global food security. My country, Japan, is itself a net food importing country which relies on international trade for more than 60% of its calorie intake. In fact, 1 in every 6 people around the world depend almost entirely on international trade to be. That is 17% of humanity, or 1.3 billion people. Currently, there are over 30 countries in the world that must rely on imported food, not to increase their food variety, but simply to avoid starvation. There are many reasons for this situation, which include low agricultural productivity and serious land and water limitations. Many of these countries lie in Africa, and some are in the Middle East. Agriculture and the environment are inextricably interlinked. Globally, agriculture uses around 40% of the global land area and about 70% of world's total freshwater. International trade in food and trade is trade in land, trade in water, and also trading in energy. In fact, as the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, tells us, if a country such as Egypt is to aim for food self-sufficiency, it would need 3 river Niles, not 1. International trade in food is therefore critical to the efficient allocation of natural resources. It allows water-intensive crops to grow where water is abundant and not in areas of water shortage, and there's much more. Our reliance on international trade for food security is only likely to grow. According to Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, if you roll the clock forward to 2050, around 50% of humanity could depend on international trade to be fed, and not just today's 17%. This is because of population growth and our changing climate. Climate catastrophes will be such that many countries will no longer be able to feed themselves. Therefore, international trade in food will become an even more important stabilizer of food supply as we go forward. At the same time, our agriculture and food systems contribute about 25% of total greenhouse gas emissions, a serious problem that we need to fix. So how can we enhance the environmental sustainability of global agri-food change while protecting the critical role of trade in food security and efficient resource use? This will be the million-dollar question that this panel will be asked to focus on. So now I'm very much pleased that we have industry leaders, farm leaders, and the distinguished ambassador of Australia with us today to discuss this complex nexus of issues. I hope that the panel will also contribute ideas as to how we could reform the trading system for better environmental outcomes. So please let me introduce the panel to you. Ambassador George Mina is the permanent representative of Australia to the WTO. Barry Martin is a Rabobank executive board member and the president of the European Association of Cooperative Banks. Rodolfo Rossi is the former president and board member of the Argentinian soybean chain. Antonia Vanna is the head of ESG Sustainability Strategy and Development of Nestlé. Lowell Randall is the Senior Vice President for Government and Legal Affairs of the Global Cold Chain Alliance. And Jojo Mabobo is the Executive Director of the Southern African Business Development Forum. So let me now open the first round of questions, and let me start with you, Ambassador Mina. The Cairns Group, which is a coalition of agriculture exporting countries in the WTO, has called for new approaches to agriculture negotiations. Do these include sustainability?
Well, Tetsuya, thank you for this opportunity, and it's marvelous to be in such distinguished company on this panel. I think you've set the context very well. We've got a global systems challenge on food and agriculture that's a triple challenge. It's about getting nutrition and food security to those who are needing it most. It's about building resilience in our system to make sure that we can deal with these issues in an environmentally sustainable way. And of course, it's about building livelihoods, particularly livelihoods of millions, billions of people working in global agriculture. So that's the triple challenge. And you said it's a $1 million question in front of us today, Tetsuya. I would venture to say it's actually an $800 billion question in front of us today, because absolutely the Cairns Group of fair traders, and we're all about fair approaches to global agricultural markets. The Cairns Group is, of course, seized of all of these imperatives, including the livelihood one and the security of food, and of course the environmental sustainability one. Now, one missing piece in the agricultural reform debate for a very long time has been the impact of agricultural policies on the planet, in particular in respect to our fight against climate change. And one missing piece in our approach to climate change mitigation has been a serious assessment of the role of agriculture and land use on the role of climate mitigation policies. And what we need to do now is, at a time when the planet is concerned very much with fighting climate change, is to integrate these two questions. It's the top imperative for almost all of our governments, and we must bring agriculture and agricultural reform into the debate. Now, some basic facts underlying these global value chains we're going to be talking about today. Underlying that are policies that distort global agriculture, to an extraordinary extent. We know from the OECD that over $800 billion goes to producer support for agriculture annually. That's 4 times global aid flows. That is an absolutely extraordinary amount. We also know from studies conducted by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, UN Environment Programme, World Bank and others, that 87% of the support that goes to agriculture is distortionary and potentially environmentally harmful. And we know that because the studies show all of the complex links that go to distorting agriculture and farm use in ways that do mean that the most efficient producers are not producing, and the most efficient flows of food, as you described it, Tetsuya, so well, to those who need it most, are not being achieved. So if we're going to deal with the agriculture problem in global emissions, you said it yourself, it's a quarter of global emissions. If we're going to bring that down, the World Bank tells us that in order to deal with this, we need to deal with agricultural subsidies. And if we don't, the studies have also shown that by 2040, we'll be in a world where emissions from agriculture have doubled if we don't deal with the subsidies task. Doubled. We've already got somewhere between 10 and 12 billion tonnes per annum of emissions emerging from agriculture. So the basic proposition is if we don't deal with agricultural subsidies and we don't bring them down, we will simply not get to net zero. And that is a very big concern for the Cairns Group and for a whole range of members in the WTO. That requires us to get back to the task of disciplining global subsidies on agriculture at the WTO urgently. I'll leave it there to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. As you rightly said, this relationship between environmental sustainability and the agricultural subsidy is very high on the agenda in various international fora, as you mentioned, in FAO, UNEP, and also OECD, which had their agriculture ministerial in the other day at the beginning of November. Thank you very much. Now, let me turn to Barry. Are you there? Yes, hello.
Hi there.
Yes. So I'd like to ask you, what role can agricultural banks play in enhancing the sustainability of the global agricultural value chain? In other words, can trade finance be a vehicle for greater sustainability? And it'll be great if you can provide us with some concrete examples, if possible. So please go ahead.
Well, thank you. And first of all, let me also commensurate you for the excellent introduction. And as you said, the whole thing is, where is population growth going to happen, and where is water and where arable land? I think that was a great introduction of how we look at it. The second thing which I would like to emphasize is that we really need to look at globally where we can produce on the most efficient way from environmental and the social point of view, the nutrition that we need. I think we have not talked about nutrition. We only talked, and that's very important, because we already know today that maybe through subsidies or through trade barriers, that a lot of nutritious food is not produced at the local where we actually have the lowest impact. And I think that was a great introduction by the representative of Australia. But let also, for me to add, a bank, as we look at the financing, as we look at the finance of the trade flows, what we're really looking at is how do we move the products around? And the role that I look at as a bank like Rabo, we actually have a role that I could divide in 4. The first thing is provide liquidity and finance. And I think as you asked for some examples, I think that's clearly examples is that we have been developing, well, not only the trade and commodity finance, which is the standard, but also make sure that you can reach deep into the regions where properly food is being produced. So what we try to do is to go to farms and try to understand how that farm is producing, what is the environmental impact of that farm. The second thing that you need to think about finance is that there's a lot of 70% to 80% of all the food in the world is produced by smallholder farmers, which we traditionally are higher risk. So we have been developing very, very clear products. What is blended finance? How do you do risk? How do you can make able to get there? And there we can think about the creation of cooperative banks, but you also can think about funds that we have been creating with blended finance structures, where we have asked for governments to come with to take the first part of the risk, so that the rest the finance can take. There is enough money out there, but we need to make sure that we de-risk one way or the other the supply chains. So the other part that we have to look at finance is that carbon has a value and social has a value. So what we need to create is products that actually pay for the environmental services and also that charge for the environmental services, I may say. So if we would like to get this whole process going. And I think if you look at the last IPCC report, that if we do it right, actually the agriculture can be net positive. And I will not go into details, but we could, if we do the right policy, if we do right things, if we reward ecological services, and if we reward also the right nutritious behavior, that we produce the best nutrition in the best place where you can produce it, I think that and I think there's also a big role for the WTO there in getting in the financing in there. So that the second role for banks, which is extremely important, is that we can get networks together on the global, like we are doing here. But the networks I'm thinking about is like the Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, that we as a financiers and the industry come together and try to arrange what are the barriers, how do we organize it. And I think, again, Australia, with I think the statement of Beef Australia saying that we can get net zero in 2030, that can only happen if we sit together in the networks and the responsible palm soy is an example of that, or even the responsible soy trade, right? So where we get all the players, the traders, everybody together to discuss about that. The third part is knowledge, and the bank has a lot of knowledge, but not only knowledge because we have big research departments, but also knowledge of our account managers, that when they sit at the farm gate level or at the boardrooms, that we have the right discussions with the players. When we sit with governments, that we can have the right players, because for us the interest is obviously that this food, the nutritious foods, flows on the right way through the whole world, because then you take the distortions away. Also very important for us is to create initiatives, like I will talk later about the true value of food initiative, because you need to get the true value of it. And we have to we have put together the World Business Council, FAO, UNEP, the GAIN, Rockefeller, everybody together. And those are the networks which is extremely important. And as last, and I will not take more time, is innovation. And I think we as a bank have a big role in innovation, not only through equity investments, but also in new products and new ways of financing. And examples are, I think so, the whole carbon, we need to be able to finance carbon on what it is. Like through, we have launched the Carbon Bank as Rabobank, but we also have launched a project called Acorn, that we will pay smallholder farmers for their carbon services around the world. And I will come to that later back if I have more time. So here I go, 4 roles for the banks: finance, networks, knowledge, and innovation. And I hope that we can also, and add the last one, is that we need to go to a transparent world where we really look at what is the true value of what we are using to produce our food. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Barry, for this concise but so rich remarks. And I also like your optimistic note that the agriculture is a big emission resources, but also can be a solution, but that requires right policies, and also, as you rightly said, the transparency. Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to ask Rodolfo. soybeans and soybean products are the most internationally traded agricultural commodities, which constitute more than 10% of global agriculture trade. Therefore, we cannot talk about sustainable agriculture trade without talking about soybeans, which you are specialized. So let me ask you, how sustainable is soybean trade?
Hi, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to talk and to join this important panel. Okay, soybean is a critical as forage as human food and is part of the green chemistry. This is highly quality, healthy food and plays a significant role in the fight against malnutrition. Soybean production has doubled in the past 20 years. It is increasing demanded to produce different kind of meat. Brazil, US, Argentina, and Paraguay are responsible for 81% of the production and over 85% of exports. Mercosur is the main producer and exporter of soy grain, meal, and oil, and soybean is produced in more than 60 countries, and China is the #1 importer and drive the market of the grain. The initial growth of the soybean production in Americas coincides with the cleaning of large areas covered by forests, grassland, and savannas that are now used for farming, and very similar to the history of the humanity in the Northern Hemisphere. That is why soybean was out of trial. In the last decades, the countries have achieved low and committed to zero deforestation and restoration. Worldwide, 50% of the land is protected, but in Brazil, you discussed yesterday, this figure is 30%. Brazil farms 8% of the territory, the US 18%, Argentina and Paraguay 14% each one, and Europe farm more than 60% of its lands. However, Mercosur countries for more than 30 years now have made a public-private commitment to use a sustainable practice system based on science and technology to protect the environment, to help producers preserve the land for future generations. According to FAO, Mercosur member countries have therefore substantially reduced carbon emission measured by gross agricultural production, a considerable improvement. The pillars of the system are non-till, intensification, diversification, and integrated nutrient management. I can detail the following milestones: non-till, soy cover, crop rotation, multiple crops by year, precision agriculture, improved seeds, new molecules for agrochemical solution, bio inputs, integrated pest management, satellite imaging, TICs, logistics, innovations such as silo bag, post-harvest management, efficient plant nutrition, precision weed management. Large crushing industry with the best management practice on food safety and chains of custody. Remember that soybean is almost self-sufficient with nitrogen and are not irrigated in Mercosur. Which are the benefits that we have documents? Reduce soil erosion by 90%, reduce water losses due to evapotranspiration by 70%, and improve water efficiency, increase water productivity, reduce the use of fused oil, releasing less greenhouse emission, favor carbon sequestration and the loss, foster biodiversity, even through soybean supply its own nitrogen. The system recycled it better and improved nutrients availability, more efficient chemical fertility, more stable and more resilient production, lower operational cost. Main producers are getting soybean genetic gain of 30 to 40 kilos an hectare in the last 20 years. Yield is very important when you use indicators. Transgenic events have had a very favorable impact, like the case of the insect-resistant soybean and herbicide-resistant. Drought tolerance of the soy is announced for the following years. An environmental sustainable certification is a requirement for trading soybean byproducts and biofuels. Therefore, we need to quantify greenhouse gas emission, especially CO2, land use change, etc. Certified production is the big challenge today and in the upcoming decades. Mercosur country and its province have had the strength to implement the neutral carbon program for oilseed and the agricultural good practice network. The commercial sector has implemented systems like VSEC at the regional level in monitoring the flow of soybean, providing evidence of the free deforestation and identify areas at risk and permitted for different use. Allow me a few more seconds for this topic of this week. EU agree law to fight global deforestation and forest degradation driven by EU production and consumption. In this sense, the same day, Mercosur President Forum expressed their concern about the evolution of legislative initiative that, inspired by legitimate concern to the environment, could lead to restrict measures for a unilateral, extraterritorial, and discriminatory nature to the detriment of the Mercosur economy. Single comments. In addition to compliance with WTO rules involving non-discrimination, EU legislation should recognize past effort and promote partnership with mutual recognition of the legal mechanism. Ignoring it will be counterproductive for trade relations, for sustainable and against multilateral rules. And the full segregation arbitrary decision will certainly alienate countries and effort towards sustainability, driving away companies and increased food and feed costs for European consumers. We are aware of it and we are discussing it, but we see nothing more than unilateral and punitory action with present challenge, but several drawbacks affecting food security and trust in the soybean value chain market.
Okay, thank you very much, Rodolfo. And you have touched upon the very the hot debate issue. But also thank you very much for the very extensive explanation how those people are engaged in soy production and trade seriously making various efforts. That's very good to hear. Now, let me turn to Antonia. And I'd like to ask you, how does Nestlé ensure environmental sustainability across its global value chain? And what obstacles does it face? So please.
Thank you very much, Tetsuo. Yes, I'm visible and you can hear me. So thank you for the invitation to this great panel and discussion on a topic that's, of course, close to what we do as Nestlé as a food producer. But it's also very often seen as the problem, although it's a source of so many solutions, and particularly when it comes to climate change. Now, first of all, for us, it's very clear that climate warming, the warming of temperature, it's not only one of the greatest challenges to society, but it's also one of the greatest sources of risk to food production. So having said this, for us, it was very clear that we have to do our part, first of all, to reduce the impact, so reduce the emissions, but also to support people, farmers, food producers on the ground to be more resilient versus the effects of climate change. So we have approached this twofold. First of all, we've set an internal framework and a set of targets. So this is our net zero roadmap, which we published as one of the first companies actually in 2020. So that's the framework. But at the same time, it's very clear we have no time to lose to do action on the ground. I mean, 2/3 of our emissions come from ingredients. About 10% is coming from our own factories, our own production sites. So with that, it was clear we have to work, and that's what we have started doing and do since many years actually already, really work with our more than 500,000 farmers with which we have contacts directly, but through our entire value chain, we address about 5 million. So this work on the ground was absolutely essential to regenerative agriculture, but at the same time also role model the reduction of emissions and resources in our own factories. Now, let me give a quick example from coffee, one of the main materials and beverages we produce. So in coffee, for example, since 2010, we have reduced by 46% the greenhouse gas emissions through our production, but also by about 50% the use of water. Now, and then we did over 900,000 trainings to farmers in the coffee area. And what was actually a great discovery, the more climate change and reducing the greenhouse gas emissions came into the forefront, is that the good agricultural practices like agroforestry, shade trees, less chemical fertilizers, etc., also really helping the farmers to supporting them in their living income. All of that together, it had also a beneficial effect on the reduction of the emissions. So we see in coffee now, where we started early with all these regenerative agricultural practices, etc., this is where we could reduce the emissions by more than half. And it was not the intent at the beginning, but it was actually a fantastical benefit. So having said this, that is a bit the good experience we make. Now, what are the challenges and the obstacles we face? So maybe just let me start on a positive side. What was absolutely helpful is that there was already, for the greenhouse gas accounting, there was already a standard in place when we put up the net zero roadmap, which has been SBTi greenhouse gas protocol. So it was already clear on the how to measure, how to calculate the emissions, how to define. That was great. Now, where we see obstacles, where we face challenges, this is on the speed and on the scale. We have no time to lose, we all know that, and we would like to move much faster. But what we see here, and I'm very grateful that the topic of subsidies was mentioned earlier, because today we still see that agriculture, which is not really helping, or which is using too many planetary resources, often this type of agriculture is still subsidized, it's still supported, whereas the supports should switch to the type of agriculture that is using less resources. So, and that would certainly speed up the process significantly and allow to scale faster. The second one is that we see lots of regulation coming up, which is excellent. However, there is often a difference in nuances on the regulation. One is focusing more on biodiversity, then the other one is on living income. Then there are different levels of traceability. So the more standardized we can operate here, the faster we will be, because then we don't need to discuss, okay, what matters here and there, although we all know there's a certain baseline which has to be adhered to which we have to adhere when it comes to particularly regenerative agricultural practices and food production. So this baseline, that should be then the global standard, and then we don't need to waste time discussing on this. We can really focus on the implementation.
Mm. Yes, thank you very much, Antonio. And you touch upon various important issues, also relating to your topic with the Ambassador Mina's point on subsidies. And that is really an important point to consider. Now, let me turn to Lowell. The question I'd like to ask you is that as you're specialized in cold chain, successful cold chain handling of perishable foods requires specialized services and expertise. This ranges from packaging services to cold chain storage environment and global distribution capabilities. How can the sustainability of cold chain handling itself be enhanced? So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this panel, and it's been a great conversation so far, and hopefully I can add some additional perspective from a different part of the food supply chain. We are the third-party logistics piece when you look at temperature-controlled products. And so the discussion about nutrition was very relevant to the cold chain because so many of the products moving through the cold chain are the higher and more nutrient-dense products and commodities. So to be able to have successful nutrition globally, you need a strong and functioning cold chain. So the Global Cold Chain Alliance, we are a global organization. We've got members in 85 countries and offices in different regions around the world that help support cold storage warehouses, refrigerated transportation, whether that's truck, rail, marine. And then we have construction and the facilities that are handling these products have a great deal to do with the sustainability of the cold chain and their systems. And so when you ask, how can the sustainability of cold chain be enhanced? That's a question that we continue to work on at the industry and association level. There's a great deal of interest and focus on sustainability. And to me, it really comes into three categories. One is operations and improving how we operate in the cold chain, whether that's warehouse operations, transportation operations, or how we build and construct this infrastructure. Technology, which goes hand in hand with operations, but the evolution of new technologies for cold chain refrigeration, whether that's the buildings themselves or transportation technology, and then policy. And I'll give a few examples of operations, technology, and policy, but I think it's those three main areas and how we're trying to improve the sustainability of the cold chain. So when we look at operations, starting with the facilities, we actually just a couple of years ago started an energy excellence program. And sustainability for the cold chain, I think, really starts with operational excellence in energy. And so our energy excellence program helps our member companies to establish an energy culture, and so they can utilize whatever technology they have. So it's technology neutral to establish that energy culture so that energy efficiency is on the top of the mind for all of the members that are participating in the program. And so we've seen success in reducing the energy consumption, and by extension, that's going to reduce our carbon footprint and environmental impact. The technology is an important component. So as we see the evolution of technology, whether that's something very simple like LED lighting in a warehouse, to advanced refrigeration, industrial refrigeration systems that are more energy efficient. And then when you look at technology in transportation, we're seeing lots of new innovations. So transportation refrigeration units on trailers and containers, we're seeing strides there, use of solar to power refrigerated trucks and trailers, which is not going to be applicable globally for quite some time, but the technology is exciting and has the opportunity to really reduce the environmental impact of the cold chain and improve sustainability. And then you've got policies. So policies, again, looking at the warehouses, the shift away from HFC refrigerants, which have a higher global warming potential, to more natural refrigerants such as ammonia and carbon dioxide. The Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol is a policy that is shifting the cold chain away from some of those more global warming substances and improving the sustainability globally. Obviously, different countries are at different paces to achieve that, but the policy momentum is certainly going in the right direction there. And then when we also look at operations and policy around the idea of reducing food loss and waste. So we know that agriculture and food production is energy intensive. So when we lose or waste that product, then that just compounds the environmental impact and challenge. So we're also working with our global partners and global food banks to address food loss and waste. There are operational considerations there, technology considerations, as well as policies to encourage food donation, to incentivize and make it easier so that we do not lose or waste food throughout the food supply chain. So again, appreciate the opportunity and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Lowell, for introducing various development in various phases of the cold change and the, as we say, food systems. And this is very important part of the whole story. And also you touched upon on food loss and waste. And this is also a very important element as we go for lesser emission and the environmental sustainability. Thank you very much. Now, last but certainly not least, let me come to Jabu. And the Southern African Business Development Forum works towards African continental integration and economic growth through the comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program. What are the challenges that African agriculture faces in ensuring sustainability, in particular as African produce goes into global value chains? And I also recall that in yesterday's opening session, Madam Kalibata talked about the importance of environmental sustainability in African agriculture. So please go ahead. Oh, Jabu, maybe you're still muting.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now it's okay. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Please, my apology for that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in such a prestigious event. Southern African Business Development Forum, as it has been introduced, we're working towards the integration of the regional intra-trade as it is premised on the newly adopted Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And there's the adoption of the comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program by the African Union, which seeks to have Africa as an agricultural-based continent. But when we look at what makes it a challenge from the onset, it's the infrastructure that enables the sustainability thereof. Agriculture is considered as a standalone program that is usually driven through the ministries of agriculture within the governments. And what we have looked into is the separation of the two, the agri-science and the agribusiness. That being, the agri-science being able to deal with the soil science and all the analysis and the protection of the environment, including the equipping of the agriculturists themselves in how to sustain and deal with the various types of soils for the conducive producing of particular commodities. But the agribusiness part of it comes in at now the trading. Post-harvest, now we are dealing with the agribusiness part of it. So when you look at what is expected and what is being done at the present moment, is that the agri-science and the agribusiness is left squarely on the shoulders of a farmer who has to do everything by himself. And you don't have the supporting infrastructure that deals with that sustainability. What we mean by that is we have identified as Southern African Business Development Forum the 4 pillars that are making it very difficult at this moment to have full agriculture and the trading with the global world, which is number 1, the transport pillar that looks at your roads, your rail, your waterways, and your air. ICT that seeks to address the ever-evolving technology, because agriculture today is more high-tech. Energy, which brings in a lot of irrigation, the cold storage that we spoke about to preserve and prevent the food losses. And the water and sanitation, which now deals with the irrigation. When you look at a country where we are presently sitting, which is Zambia, Zambia it's considered landlocked, but we consider it as land-linked because we are having 8 borders that connect Zambia. It is a country that has about 75 million hectares of land, out of which 58% of it, which is about 48 million hectares, is classified as medium to high potential for agricultural production. However, only 15% of this land is currently under cultivation. And most of it is because agricultural support is solely on the shoulders of government at this moment. And when you look at government has a lot of competing agendas. It is mainly have to drive the social development of the country, deal with disasters and all that. So if it has to also invest in infrastructure that will enable agriculture, it makes it a challenge. So the access roads into these farms, the putting in of electricity and energy into the farms, the putting in of ICT into those farms, and linking those farms to the markets now becomes a challenge. So that is where we came in as Southern African Business Development Forum to say, how then do we bring these small-scale farmers, which in Zambia they contribute, they are about 90% of them, to move them out of that sustainers, subsistence farmers into the main scale production. So the investment that has to go in there has to look at what my fellow panelist from Robobank mentioned. How do you de-risk them at this moment? Because that 90% depends on natural rains for their irrigation. And if you are to fund and to give them resources, it becomes now a higher risk. So we've created this ecosystem that now needs to look at linking the neighboring countries that will enable us to trade with one another and then move these economies of scale. For example, Zambia is neighboring Angola. And since independence, some 56 years ago, there's never been a road or road network that connects Zambia and Angola. And as a result, Angola depends mainly on imports from China, Brazil, Chile, and the other countries. Yet, Zambia is a stone throw away and produces most of the produce that are consumed in Angola. According to the UN Common Trade in 2021, Brazil has supplied about $407 million worth of produce to Angola. And China has traded with Angola over 57 billion worth of commodities. So if we are to look into that, it can really transform if we can bridge these challenges by coming together as business, invest in this infrastructure development and not look at it as infrastructure, but look at it as enablers, and it becomes cost of production, which then gets offset at harvest. For us to be able to mitigate and push these economies of scale. Because it is a known fact that all the world, the West, the East, are now looking at Africa as a country that has most arable land to produce and feed the world. But if the infrastructure around it does not create a suitable environment for that to happen, then we will be looking back and it will not be something that can be achieved. Because if you look at now investment and capital looks at quick return, but how then do you upscale these 90% that are still subsistence farmers to align with the first world and be able to meet this challenge? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jabu. And you pointed out the very much importance of this many small farmers, the importance of infrastructure, which resonate with the one of the Barry's point, as you mentioned. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to go to and start the second round of questions. Before the session, Ambassador Mina told me that the biggest challenge for moderator is to try to shut up the panelists. But as all the panelists made a very important point. So that was a very exciting first round, but unfortunately that makes the second round of question and remarks, we have to make it a bit shorter. So I'd like to ask you all to answer the question I pose in 2 minutes rather than 4 minutes. So please make your points very concise and not losing the content, preferably. So let me again start with Ambassador Mina. How, in Australia's view, can we green the WTO? So please also comment on ongoing trade and environment discussion at the WTO. So please, Ambassador.
And so I'll try and set a good example for your 2 minutes. Really, we've got 3 areas of work at the WTO on trade and sustainability. And people talk about all sorts of initiatives. I'm going to talk about it at the level of systems, at the level of oceans, and then at the level of land. At the level of systems, we've got a reasonable dialogue underway. Bringing the trade and climate regimes together is going to be hard, though. We know that dealing with carbon leakage in a way that's also facilitates trade is hard. We're at a very early stage of dealing with this at level of systems. On oceans, I'll give us a big tick on oceans. We've made a huge contribution to the sustainability of our oceans by making a new global deal on fisheries subsidies. We've made a start on some important work on plastics. We're doing a lot of work in the context of the trade and sustainability environmental structure discussions to integrate the trade regime with issues like plastics. So we're getting somewhere on oceans. I'll give us a tick on oceans. But on land, we're failing. We've heard very eloquently from Antonio before what a company like Nestle has to do to drive good environmental practices from its producers. We've heard from our last speaker just now about some of the challenges that Jabu was talking about in Angola and Zambia in trying to liberate the power of small-scale farmers. The Cairns Group is about that sort of agriculture, blessed by nature, working with nature, the sun and the water that is there. These are not subsidised farmers. These are farmers, 16 out of the 19 countries of the Cairns Group, just like the ones in Zambia and Angola, are dealing with the blessings of nature. And these are important points, because if we don't deal with nature, if we deal with imposed policy, if we try and work with subsidies, if we try and work with tariff barriers, you distort nature. So unleash the power of the farmers that can work with nature. That is the first thing we can do. And we can do that by opening market barriers on agriculture. I've talked already about subsidies. That is worsening the problem dramatically. And we've got to stop the global subsidies problem on the environment. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm sorry for this shortened period of time, but I think you made a very important point. Now, come to Barry. Barry, as the world moves closer to the Sustainable Development Goals, can global food and agriculture value chain become the engines of a circular economy?
Oh, thank you. Look, I feel humbled by the other panelists. So let me say, I'm a farmer myself in Brazil, besides a banker, that food and agri is the ultimate circular economy. And I was already saying that we can be net positive. So let me quickly go how I look at it, right? So why can we get net positive? And that's also based on what IPCC said. 15 gigatons is what we think we're going to emit to produce food. If we reduce rainforest cuttage, it's already 4 gigatons of reduction. So let's stop doing the rainforest. We should be very clear on that. And WTO can have a huge impact on that, just cutting it out, right? So just saying, this is no trade on this product. The same thing is what we call to replant what was degraded. We have a lot of land which is degraded and could be replanted by trees. And we could pay for that through the carbon price, the carbon credits. That's another 4 gigatons. And then we have 4 gigatons, which the IPCC said, I'm saying more or less, is about the regenerative farming or soil health coalition, whatever you want to call it. It's just do what we have learned as a practice, is that if you don't till, and my colleague out of Argentina was saying that if you don't till, if you do the rotation, etc., all the good things, you reduce pesticides, that's another 4 gigatons. If we do about the production, if we change some of our production, so the tractor's not on diesel anymore, let's do tractors on regenerative agriculture, regenerative biofuels. If we think about the other part, which is that we reduce the plastics in our products, all those things, will reduce again another 4 gigatons. So if you add to that the 15 and 4 times 4, you get the plus. So that's why I say food and agri is the ultimate circular. But then I go to the consumer. The problem today is that unhealthy food and unsustainable food is cheap. And the reason why it's cheap is that we have not included the price of externalities into that. So the environmental externalities, the social externalities, and actually the health externalities. So there's tons of studies saying that the actual price of food is actually 3 times more than what we do right now. So I hope that when you look at it and we look at the system and with governments and the way also WTO should work in it, is that the system starts to give transparency. And that's why to what is actually in that food, how much environment went in that food. And you don't even need to increase the price, but only make it transparent is what is that. And then I hope that sustainable food, nutritious food would be cheap. And the other ones that consumers ourselves would actually be expensive. And I think that's where also WTO should have a big role in trying to identify that. And you talk about the green WTO. The green WTO should have the data to show this is a product that's actually harmful and against social impact, and as we saw from our colleague out of Africa, and this is the product that actually is positive, so that we can actually change policy and steer the world, because we need the consumer to change the mindset. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry. You touched upon again a very important point of the consumer side of the story, and how to incorporate those externalities, whether positive or negative. That is also a very important point as we consider the way forward. Thank you very much. Now, next is Antonia. For a company as big as Nestle to achieve sustainability, it must deal with standards, both good and bad. To what extent does the WTO help companies like Nestle through the agreements such as the Agreement on Technical Barriers of Trade, TBT, and also the Agreement on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Standards, SPS? And what more can the WTO do?
Thank you very much. I'll make also very quick 3 points. The first one is a global value chain will be needed in future as well. So it's not about stopping global value chains. Why? Because only when agricultural materials are produced where they have the best environment, only then they can be produced in a resourceful, so with the least resources, and then it's sustainable. Otherwise it's not. So we need this global value chain and global trade. Now, second, what is most important to allow this to happen? And Tetsuo, you mentioned it at the very beginning already. It is, we need the international rules, and where I think WTO can help is to have the baseline for sustainability, be it on climate or when we look at packaging, recyclability, to have this, the minimum standard actually built into the rules. That is my second point. And maybe in addition to this second one, it includes also the customer, the consumer facing side. To avoid this confusion, which we still have today when I look at certain claims like carbon reduction, etc. So the international rules, if that could go into also what's consumer facing into claims, that would really help. And the last one and the third point is also best practice sharing. Absolutely. I mean, this is where we think WTO can be of huge help, and it would be very enriching to understand what works best, what doesn't work. And that's a good guidance, certainly for us.
Thank you very much, Antonia, for this very concise but also very important message. Now, Lowell, let me come back to you. Much of the work of the Global Cold Chain Alliance depends on a successful services agreement in the WTO. To what extent does the WTO boost the work of the alliance through the General Agreement on Trading Services? And what more can the WTO do?
Thank you, and I'll try to be very brief as well. Obviously, trade is so critical, and having successful services agreements and other policies that the WTO promotes and provides is critical. Supply chain and trade disruptions have a very negative impact on sustainability and the efficient movement of food globally. When you think about, if a shipment were going from continent to continent and it's turned back, think about the higher energy consumption, the potential for food loss and waste, the increase to the carbon footprint. If you've got delays in trade processing, these perishable commodities, you can't just turn off the refrigeration units. So you're using fuel, and you have the potential that food is potentially going to get lost or wasted. So the more we can harmonize trade policies and use some common sense as well. Sometimes we see shipments delayed or turned back because of very minor clerical errors, misspelled words or typographical errors. And so the more that we can utilize common sense at border crossings, at ports, to minimize these disruptions, the better we can make the supply chain more efficient, which is going to make it more sustainable.
Okay, thank you very much, Lowell. And my very apology, I may have skipped Rodolfo. Now, can I come back to you? And as you mentioned in your first intervention, soybeans are often the victims of trade wars. in the with one country penalizing another using higher tariffs on soybeans. So could you explain to us the impact of these measures on global food security and also the environmental sustainability?
Okay, thank you. Okay, I see three important issues. In the first place, it's extremely dangerous for food security in the trade war to hold raw material to high value and impact on food security, such as soybean hostage. When the China-USA war, China penalized the US, it generates an international risk, price fluctuation and market access. Current geopolitical changes should not be affect essential product for food security. In reference to price, taking the case of my country, when soybean represent the main #1 export sector of the economy and is the #1 meal and soybean worldwide export, when China responded to the high tariff to the US, soybean price fell to the lowest in 11 years. This value affects producers due to the lower income that they obtain from selling the production, farmer contractors, suppliers of inputs, machinery, etc., etc. Also reducing the planting area the next season. On the other hand, farmers in US received millions of aid from the government since they were very affected. There were also a concern that other countries will take the US export to China, which happened and remain in part. In second place, is that they promote trade flow that are not natural. The historical flow from US to China began to have replacement. Brazil, which was the second step to the first, promoting the expansion in Brazil, but also generates in other countries that produce little return or begin to produce because of the distorting effect of the scenario. In the case of Brazil, this generates many critical opinions about the advance of the agricultural frontier in Brazil. Related with this, the third topic that I like to mention is environmental. To reinforce this aspect, I say that naturally the flow from a penalized country that sell to another is because they are the mostly environmental efficient to produce and market. Therefore, the emission of greenhouse gases and the good agronomic practice are questioned when the trade war attack and punish commodities.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo. Yes, exactly. Those kind of things would, as you said, make an effect of various areas of supply chains, and also, as you mentioned, it's not about only about the economy, but also the environment. Thank you very much. Now let me turn to Jabu. The question is there tension between the food security and environmental sustainability in Africa? And if so, how can we reconcile these two?
Thank you very much. I think we can start looking at the issue of underdevelopment and poverty, where a lot presently are depending on charcoal for trade, which does the deforestation. And in order to have that, we have to introduce the sustainable agriculture, because what forces a lot of people to focus on charcoal is, number one, there's no electricity or other source of energy production. And secondly, is because what they produce in their small farms don't have access to the markets, and as a result, it ends up in food waste. So they end up being discouraged, and they look at it as being a waste of time going into farming. That is the subsistence farmers. So to cap that, we look at introducing into them the One Health program that the United Nations is producing, is promoting rather, where you have to care for the environment, you have to care for the animals, and you have to care for the environment as human beings, because we share the same environment with animals and human beings. And also the good agricultural practices that introduces your farm assurances, when you start. But that on its own, it's a huge investment that needs to be put into this small scale farming. And the challenge that goes with that is that that huge burden of that training and development is left squarely on the shoulders of governments. And governments, we know that they have a short lifespan, usually of 5 years. So, and every 5 years there comes in elections, and it is not usually that it happens with the continuity of the programs. The new administration that comes in will want to rubbish that was done by the predecessors because they are voted in by the manifestos that they campaign with. So we see a lot of interruptions in terms of that. So, and agriculture being a long-term investment business, and it depends on the security of land tenure, we see a critical stakeholder that has been left out in most of these years, which are the traditional leaders. They are usually not consulted. Organizations like WTO and other organizations, they focus on working with governments and only go to the rural areas where traditional leaders are based just to introduce the plans. And traditional leaders usually resist because they have not been part of the consultation from the beginning, and yet they are the custodians of land. So, and traditional leaders don't have the tenure of office. So when we have agreements with them and they are empowered, it gives that sustainability, because the politicians that hold office, they come from those traditional areas as well. So the other part that we need to look into is, when you look at Africa now as underdeveloped, if we want to put in investment that will take these subsistence farmers into commercial farmers, we are leapfrogging into the new technology, which is 5G and that which drives the global economy. But we need to look at the literacy gap between these subsistence farmers and the global demands. So there needs to be a huge skills development that has to go into this space. And usually as businesses, there is less appetite and skills development that goes in there. So if we can build an ecosystem like the one that we are building as Southern African Business Development Forum, where we are bringing financiers, government, stakeholders like landowners and traditional leaders and the subsistence farmers, we create now this ecosystem that depends on each other. So this is the help that we require from the World Trade Organization to say, let us look at issues of skills development and impartation of these skills and technologies as one of the primary aims or points where you can claim as a business and in having developed. So we will see now harmony in moving, because definitely Africa is a place where you can be, and we can do a lot in guiding on how to deal with the critical stakeholders that are our traditional leaders, on how to then work and coexist with them. And that contributes to the rural development that will aid in curbing the rural-urban migration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rabu. You touch upon a very on-the-ground issue, the very important implementation and challenges in each country, between the relationship between the government and the community and
Did we lose Yoshiko?
Tetsuo, I think we may have lost the moderator for a few seconds. So until he reconnects, let me start fielding some of the questions that we've received from viewers. I'm Doa Abdelmotal. I'm from the WTO Secretariat. I know many of you, and it's wonderful to see you here. I'm sure Tetsuo will reconnect. Tetsuo, you've reconnected. Let me hand over to you. You're on mute.
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
can hear you. Over to you.
Okay, I'm sorry for this interruption. Now we have received many questions from viewers, so please be as brief as you can in responding. 1 minute, and I'll begin again with Ambassador Mina. This is a question from viewer from Italy. Australia is a major exporter of meat. How is it reducing livestock emissions?
Thanks, Vera. Very effectively. You heard earlier, I think, from Berry about the commitment of the beef industry worldwide to lower emissions. The Australian beef industry is actually committed to net zero by 2030. They're leading global technology to reduce emissions from the beef industry and have technology that can reduce the beef emissions by 90%. So some of what we've just been hearing from Jabu about the need for technical assistance we are doing. Australia has $100 million in technical assistance for agriculture every year, and we're trying to share some of this technology. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now to Barry. This is a question from a viewer from India. Agricultural banks encouraging speculation in the midst of this food crisis and raising the price of food. So please.
Well, I don't know exactly where he is referring to. I don't think that that's where we are at, right? So the reality is that you finance smallholder farmers, you finance farmers on the production side. We are not, as a banks, involved in that speculation. It's certainly not Rabo. I think there you should go rather look at investment funds, etc., that look at the global trends. And I think the reality is that we have seen environmental shocks and war-like shocks that allow people to take positions and speculate, but that's not where agricultural banks should be. On the contrary, we as agricultural banks should be focused on how can we make sure that the cash flows come to the farmers. And that's the commitment of Rabo as a global agricultural bank with the tens of millions of farmers that we finance, from large to small farmers. Is our commitment is how we get cash flow. And that's why I alluded to the Acorn project, is where we are trying to pay to smallholder farmers for the creation of biomass on their farms. So when you do agroforestry, the idea is that you grow trees and we make sure that that cash flow comes to the smallholder farmers. And that's what we should be looking at as agricultural banks, is how do we enhance cash flows and we pay for the social and environmental services that these millions of people give us as society.
Thank you very much, Barry, for that very clear answer. Now, I'll turn to Rodolfo. This is a question from a viewer from France. Livestock is a major contributor to climate change, and the world must cut meat consumption. With a lot of soybean going to animal feed, should this trade continue?
The question is if trade continued, no, you say? Yes, I think that for us, that we are the #1 exporter of meal to Europe. We export 30% of our exportation, okay? And I think that Europe needs soybean, okay? They are making efforts locally to produce soybean, including with some East countries that can produce soybean. There are a debate about GMO or no GMO, but I think that the world trade is GMO for far, okay? I think that soybean will be the main support to meat, different meat, including fishes, no fishery in the world. Fishery in the world is 30% of the meat that the world consumption is, okay? We are aware of the new green meat, okay? But I think that we will grow in the future. But soybean still we still producing to produce meat, because when the income of a country increase, the people prefer meat today and in the future. But I agree that we need a big compromise with environmental. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Rodolfo. Well, this beef issue is one of the big issues, and as Barry and also Ambassador Mina talked about the how to enhance the environmental sustainability in beef production itself. But once again, beef is certainly the big emissioner of agriculture. So we need to try to solve this issue to enjoy the OZ beef in the future, of course. Huh? Yes, and the next is Antonio. This is a question from a viewer from China. Is Nestle trying to produce more food locally instead of shipping food across the globe? And this is a bit related to your last intervention. So please.
Thank you very much. Produced locally, absolutely. I mean, we are really producing in each and every country, and that's for a good reason, because we see ourselves, okay, it's a global company, but we're a local player. Yeah, we're enshrined into the local community, and producing there is part of it, very clear. So my comment earlier, it was more to having still the possibility to let's say to source, to get the ingredients from where they are most efficiently, from an environmental point of view, most efficiently produced. But this also, that needs to be looked at end to end. Yeah, so the transport is part of it. So that's why, and it was really linked to the sourcing of ingredients mostly. So we always strive to do what's best from an environmental point of view, end to end, including the transport. And if something is available in the country, I mean, the first attempt is always to really get it completely there. That's the first one. Only if that's not possible, then we reach out. And usually both come actually quite nicely together, because if something is available in a country at a certain volume, then usually the natural conditions are also the right ones to do that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Antonia. Now, let's turn to Lowell. And this is a question from a viewer from the United States. Has any calculation been made of the amount of food waste that cold chain storage prevents?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. And it really depends on where the food waste occurs. So when you look at post-harvest to consumer, that's where our members in the cold chain, that's their role in the food supply chain. And that plays a critical role in reducing food loss and waste, because that food is preserved and moved to where it will ultimately be consumed. So we play a vital role in reducing that food loss. I know the statistics are going to be different for each market. So in developing world, you've got more food loss in the early stages of the food production system. And in more developed economies, you've got much more waste at the consumer end. So it really depends on the place, the country, the economy that we're talking about, where the primary food loss is occurring. Regardless, though, you have to have a functioning and efficient cold chain to minimize that loss from post-harvest to consumption.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lowell. Yes, when we talking about all those environmental sustainability issues, how to calculate or assess the situation is always an important part of the story. But anyway, as you said, there must be efforts in every aspects of the value chain, as you said. Okay, so now can I ask a question to Jabu? This is a question from a viewer from South Africa. How can we avoid that agriculture contribute to deforestation? Jabu, you mentioned a bit about deforestation in your last remarks, but this is a related question, so please.
Thank you very much. I think what we need to look into are the good agricultural practices that we need to bring in. Most on the majority of those that are in the small scale production are those who have not had the opportunity of being trained in good agricultural practice, and mainly to do with the history of our continent and South Africa in particular, because of the history where we come from. Most Black people were farm workers, and they've been looking at the farm as a place where they were just offering labor. Now they have to turn and be the farm managers and the farm owners. So it comes in with a lot of understanding, first, of the species that are there that needs to be preserved. When you have to clear the field for production, how do you then plant trees that can coexist with other crops? For example, when you do macadamia, how can you then utilize the other crops? So it's training, and more training that we need to focus on. And South Africa, fortunately, is where I was born. So I understand the challenges that are mainly taking place in
Oh, Jabu, I cannot hear you.
Hear me now?
Ah, yes, it's okay.
Oh,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
No, I was saying most of that depends on the training aspect that needs to be invested more in this aspect. Like I mentioned in my earlier opening, you are dealing with those that were disadvantaged, and they have to leapfrog into the new technologies and the modern agricultural trends that are being introduced. We can't do it the old primitive way where you just clear land for the sake of clearing, and yet the small hectareage that you want to use. So land management is what is critical. And this is what we need to learn from first world countries like Brazil. And this is where we are pleading for the WTO to come in with help. And that investment in skills development can then contribute towards credit points to those that are lending. But we'll be tapping into the ambassador in Australia for help in the technological, in the agri-tech. They are advanced, and they've been doing it better than most of us in the rest of the world. So we will be knocking very close.
Oh. Oh. Jabu is cut off, but I think he emphasized the importance of skill training and land management, and he also, in that context, refers to the technical assistance that Ambassador Mina also mentioned. So now we have come to the end of this fourth roundtable, and there are well, I thank you all the panelists for very, very rich discussion, and my honest feeling is that we need a whole day discussion for this important theme. There are many aspects that we have to think about, but one impressive thing is that as Ambassador Mina pointed out, that the WTO has successfully concluded the fisheries subsidies agreement in June this year, and there are discussion going on plastic, ocean, and also the system. we have to follow suit and do more in agriculture. So this is a very important message that we have to think about. So once again, let me thank all the panelists for this very rich discussion, and also thank all the viewers for being with us. And I like to ask viewers to stay with us for the next 5th roundtable, which is industry views on the rules-based multilateral trading system, which will start shortly at 11:20 a.m. Central Eastern Time. So please use the live stream link on the same WTO homepage. So this is the end of the 4th round table. So thank you very much and bye-bye. Thank you very much for all the panelists.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Could you please put on your cameras? Thank you. You may start the session. Thank you. Hello, Hassan.
Hello.
Hello. You may kick off the session. Thank you so much.
I can start now.
Yes, you can. Thank you.
Hello. Welcome to the fifth roundtable of the Agri-Food Business Day, entitled Industry Views on the Rules-Based Multilateral Trading System. Welcome to our panelists and a warm welcome to our viewers all over the world. My name is Hassan Toure. I'm the WTO Agricultural Attaché for the Gambia, and I'll be moderating this session. I'll be putting 2 rounds of questions to our panelists, after which I'll be opening the floor to questions from you, the viewers. Viewers can send questions to dialogues@wto.org. That is dialogues@wto.org. Let me begin by providing some context for today's event. The goal of the WTO's Agri-Food Business Day, which is a new initiative of the WTO, is to provide an opportunity for WTO members to interact with farmers and the private sector in order to hear about trade barriers on the ground. The multilateral trading system is key to ensuring global food security. International trade feeds 1 in every 6 people around the globe. The goal of this session, therefore, is to hear from the agri-food sector whether the trading system is working as it should, and if not, what more can be done. Agri-Food Business Day comes in the middle of one of the most serious food crises that the world has known. Global food systems have been shaken recently, first by the pandemic and now by the tensions in the Black Sea region. The FAO Food Price Index is higher than last year, with global inflation and the strong US dollar exacerbating the food crisis. In some countries, food inflation at the national level has reached 300 or even 400%. Furthermore, the World Food Programme's cost of doing business has risen tremendously as a result of these developments, putting at risk its ability to deliver humanitarian assistance to millions at need. The global food crisis is not only serious, but it is far from over. In fact, it is compounded by a fertilizer crisis that has already impacted this year's planting seasons. The result being that next year, we may face a serious problem of food availability. There's no doubt that tensions in the Black Sea have struck at the heart of one of the world's most competitive breadbasket regions, and we must now face its full consequences. Businesses have been reporting all sorts of disruptions to international trade and global value chains, ranging from an inability to access agricultural inputs like fertilizer and an inability to get a hold of grain, to all sorts of logistical disruptions with the closure of the airspace above the conflict zone and blockages in key ports. In addition, the agri-food industry is having to contend with many emergency regulations enacted by governments to confront the crises that are impacting the ease of doing business. So with me here today is a very distinguished panel of farmer and industry representatives to discuss all of these issues. I'm also particularly honored that we have the European Commission with us. So please let me, without further ado, introduce this very distinguished panel to you. First, we have Mr. John Clark, who is the Director for International Affairs, DG Agriculture and Rural Development of the European Commission. He's also a former head of the EU delegation to the World Trade Organization. We also have Lloyd Day, who is the Deputy Director General of the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. We have as well Ricardo Calderon Lopez, who is the Executive Director of APAMEX, or known as the Asociación de Proveedores de Productos Pequeros of Mexico. We also have Donald Moore, who is the Executive Director of the Global Dairy Platform. Rick White as well, who is the President and CEO of the Canadian Canola Growers Association. And finally, we also have Ms. Lucy Mushoki, who is the CEO of Pan-African Agribusiness and Agro-Industry Consortium. So let me now open the floor to our panelists, starting with the first round of questions. I would like to focus in this round on impacts of the food crisis by region and by sector, as seen by farmers, industry, and the WTO. So John Clark, let me start with you. How has the multiple crises that have impacted food trade found reflection in the WTO, whether COVID or the war? What are the new trade issues that have emerged in the Committee on Agriculture and the new trade concerns due to these unfortunate developments? Mr. Clark, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Toure, for inviting me along with practitioners in the private sector. And you've rightly mentioned COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine as two factors which have exacerbated food security. The Russian invasion alone, according to FAO, is going to put another 13 million people into acute food insecurity next year. And these are not just statistics, but human lives and suffering we're talking about. And most recently, the Russian restrictions on the exports of fertilizers is going to worsen the crisis even more, especially for African agriculture. But apart from COVID and the invasion, I mean, the third and by far the biggest factor impacting food security is climate change and its impact on food production. So all these three factors have taken us to a situation where there are over 200 million acutely food insecure people in developing countries, which is catastrophic. And what's most distressing is that it means in practice that the SDG goal of zero hunger is receding further and further away as we speak. So it's an extremely distressing situation. Now, you asked how these crises are being reflected in the WTO and in the Committee on Agriculture. I think we cannot expect the WTO to shoulder the burden of all the world's problems, but the trading system can contribute along with other organizations and along with members' domestic policies to alleviate the situation. And in WTO, I think, first of all, members are starting to recognize, based on evidence, that a proper functioning of markets is really essential to combat food insecurity. So that's, in simple terms, supplies can reach those who need them the most and at an accessible price and on time. Because we do have enough food production and food in the world, it's simply out of reach for many poor countries and populations. Secondly, I think the members in the WTO, in the Committee on Agriculture, are starting to realize that we seriously need to tackle export restrictions in the WTO as an urgent measure. The WTO's own recent report from a few weeks ago tells us that the export restrictions on foodstuffs and inputs is proliferating. There are now 129 restrictive measures in place on the exports of agri-food and inputs. And we all know that export restrictions, even if they respond to populist political demands in the countries that impose them, are ultimately self-defeating. They are beggar thy neighbor policies, and they punish vulnerable import-dependent countries. So more transparency, but above all, stronger rules are needed to ensure that any export restrictions on food are genuinely justified, are proportionate, and are temporary in nature. And thirdly and finally, the WTO Agriculture Committee has now set up a work program to implement the recent NC12 declaration on the emergency response to food insecurity, focusing on how to increase the resilience, I would say, of the least developed countries and other vulnerable import-dependent countries. That discussion will need to look at not only immediate measures to improve food security, but also look at the long-term sustainability of agricultural production in the face of climate pressure. That debate's going to take the WTO out of its comfort zone, out of its traditional area of work, but it's absolutely essential. And I hope that through a combination of the pressure on food security and on sustainability, we can actually move the membership in WTO to actually negotiate some stronger rules that will improve agricultural and food trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clark, for your insights, and we'll come back to you in the later session. So let me now turn to Mr. Lloyd Day. Lloyd, how is the food crisis playing out in the Americas, and what is the Inter-American Institute seeing? Thank you.
Well, good morning, Hassan, and good morning to my fellow panelists. I think I know most of you. And for those who I don't know, it's nice to meet you here virtually, as we've lived our world virtually for the last couple of years, although we have started to travel, and I'm still recovering from a cold that I caught at the COP27 in Egypt. So I apologize if my voice is a little scratchy. On behalf of ICA, who represents the Ministers of Agriculture of the Americas from Canada to Argentina and the Caribbean as well, we're very pleased to be a part of this WTO Agri-Food Business Day. We think it's really important that the WTO is focusing on the importance of agri-food trade. Especially, it's a very positive contribution in the debate in the midst of this global food security crisis that you've talked about and John just talked about as well. There's some heavy lifting ahead for the WTO, especially as it gets into areas that are really beyond its scope, such as the environment and climate and sustainability issues. From the perspective of the Americas, we want to see a functioning WTO to help facilitate global food and agri trade that benefits everyone. And everyone on these panels, as John just did, articulating this very well for the past couple of days. The food crisis in the Americas is playing out perhaps better than in some parts of the world, as we are not dependent on imports from the Black Sea theater. But all of our countries, like the rest of the world, are suffering from the current global economic slowdown, rising energy and fertilizer prices, and rising inflation. Global stocks in grains and vegetable oils were at the lowest levels in years as a result of the pandemic and the post-pandemic recovery, which is very fast, especially in China, which had record imports. And the La Nina phenomenon had led to lower than expected levels of production here in the Americas. All this at the same time with global inflation rising and international freight rates also rising because of this another strict lockdown in China affecting the global supply chain. Add the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you naturally see prices rising to new highs, but that's now returned pre-war levels, which indeed were very high. And of course, that's subject to price volatility due to weather, which affects agriculture. But overall, Latin America and North America are net food exporters, so our big economies stand to benefit from higher prices. But of course, our consumers are suffering from the high prices, and COVID had a negative impact on food security in the region with a rise in poverty and a great deal of dependence. So import-dependent economies, such as in the Caribbean, which is an important part of our zone, are suffering greatly. Regarding the WTO and the multilateral trading system, I think there's a few key messages that are important to articulate. First is the important role of international trade that all the panels have discussed, but its important role in food security and the transformation of national agri-food systems, connecting them to each other and helping shape a more sustainable global food system. There's some key rules that need to be articulated. It redistributes food production. It increases the quantity and quality of products in all regions, thus consolidating food and nutrition security on a global scale, not just a national scale. It increases the variety of food available, which expands the frontier of consumer choice. It improves economic access to food for the most vulnerable populations and acts as a price stabilizer. Thus, the export restrictions that John just talked about are detrimental. We know that. It helps cope with hunger and malnutrition. It contributes to the consumption of safe food through the use of sanitary standards and internal production and distribution systems that have global impact, and adhering to the science around sanitary issues and health issues is very important. And it creates opportunities to improve agricultural productivities and increase farmers' incomes, in this way constituting a powerful mechanism for the dissemination of technologies and best practices, which I'll get into later. And finally, movement of food from surplus regions to deficit regions favors the efficient allocation of global resources, including natural resources. I think a final message related to this is the importance of the looming policy threats by certain countries and regions of the world that are imposing trade barriers based on ideology or perceived consumer preferences, export restrictions, or precautionary principles based on populism and fear of food supply, instead of accepted science and economics by global scientific authorities. This is perhaps the greatest threat to productivity in a functioning international trade system, but we're just delighted that the WTO has taken this up because its role in providing a transparent, functioning trade system is vital to the efficient allocation of food around the world. And that's going to be the real key to tackling food security issues. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Lloyd, for those insights. Ricardo, let us zoom in on Mexico. The Mexican government has called on farmers in the country to produce more of their own food for greater self-sufficiency in key commodities and to control the prices of basic foodstuffs amid difficult global conditions. Describe to us how the food crisis is currently playing out in Mexico.
Good morning, and firstly, let me show our gratefulness for the opportunity of having this space for expressing alternate voices. And well, as a Mexican organization, I will begin and start with this question with my Mexican profile. Being the Agricultural Products Providers Association of Mexico, APAMEX, I think it's easier to pronounce, the organization that represents the international trade of bulk agricultural products and food ingredients in the country, and also related services to this specialized trade, such as transportation, warehousing, and certification. In that sense, we have monitored and contributed to the exchange of information through top organizations in Mexico, especially the National Agricultural Council, with the federal government, specifically the Secretariats of Agriculture and Economy, the second who is in charge of domestic and foreign trade, have monitored the impacts of international inflation of agricultural products and of other related ones, such as energy and agricultural production inputs, influencing supply chains from abroad and internally towards national food markets, and finally, hitting the consumers. The causes of inflation have expanded and intensified since the COVID-19 pandemic due to factors already and widely known and that have been very frequently, you can say, explained in these panels from the previous year and starting the current one. In the domestic markets, however, there has been no evidence of shortage of any staple food product, while added national production and imports, and given the strength derived from the supply chains built and consolidated in the last 30 years, in the interior with the domestic production, consistent, although with low growth, and with a significant component of commercial integration in the North American region, while having other supplementary chains originating mainly with third countries of Mercosur and eventually with Europe. With this at hand, high degrees of self-sufficiency and even export surpluses have been achieved in value-added products such as animal proteins and industrialized foods and other types of products. In fruits and vegetables, Mexico is a world exporting power. The domestic production of maize for human food consumption is self-sufficient and eventually with surplus. Therefore, there exists a high food security degree in Mexico. Based on the factors that complicated these chains, such as the pandemic and in its repercussions on logistic systems, which already had their own failures, a trend in the public sector was strengthened, shared but with a different vision by the private agri-food sector, to achieve a higher degree of self-sufficiency in staple foods, precisely to mitigate shock effects from abroad, such as inflation and scarcity, which makes a strategic sense for sufficiency and stabilization of domestic markets. The public sector proceeded to implement a policy of deep restructuring of the productive sector from the beginning of the current administration. now reinforcing the transfer of direct public resources towards the segments of small and medium producers, complementing with additional supports as subsidized fertilizers and guaranteed minimum prices to the growers, now useless by the international price leveling and having availability of government's distribution channels. So that's a set of supports that the government is giving to the productive sector right now. However, the sudden change left the medium and large producers that provide high yield commercial production with substantially less support compared to those that were complementary to mitigate their costs for several decades. This has slowed down investment and has even shifted areas from highly productive basic crops to others with higher profitability, in a transition that small producers are unable to replace. In May and September were issued presidential decrees where the first deepened support for small and medium-sized producers and contained more supports in fuel and energy with price subsidies, with the limitation of tariffs and provision of some import facilitation measures, especially for staple foods and their inputs. The second decree grouped a list of products and large industrial, animal production and commercial companies which received extraordinary facilities for food and input imports, including sanitary and phytosanitary optional self-regulation and exemptions, if committing to a reduction and stabilization of prices by each of them as a trade-off. The inflation rate in Mexico thus has reached a maximum of 8.7% per year in August and September, and decreased in October and November, with a positive average spread of plus 6.52 points for agricultural products from that 8.7% between January and November, but drastically decreasing in November to only plus 1.09 points, which could be more of a gradual effect of the plummeting of the prices reflected in the FAO Food Price Index since May and its stabilization between September and November, with some other possible contribution from the decrease that I already mentioned, which are hardly measurable or differentiable between each other. With that, I made you can say a landscape of what the situation in Mexico has ongoing, and how the Mexican government and the private sector, with their own views and with similar targets, are trying to mitigate somehow with measures, public measures, and in the case of the public sector with efficiencies and maybe widening investments in other, you can say, branches of the agricultural production. With that, I finish my intervention for the moment.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for sharing your perspectives on what is happening in Mexico. We'll now turn to another North American country. Donald, let's turn to the dairy sector. What has been the impact on these multiple crises on the dairy sector? Clearly, there have been some negative impacts, but have there been any positive ones too?
Well, thank you, Hassan, and good day to everyone, and hello to my fellow panelists as well. I'm Donald Moore, the Executive Director of the Global Dairy Platform, and while I'm sitting here in North America, the organization that I represent has members all over the world. So before I start, I'd like to just put my comments into perspective. Dairy is the world's largest agricultural commodity by value and the third largest by volume. There are some 133 million dairy farms in the world, with 600 million people living on those farms and a further 400 million people dependent upon the full-time jobs upstream and downstream from those farms for their livelihoods, let alone the 6 billion people who regularly consume dairy as part of a healthy diet. Dairy has perhaps got the shortest value chain from cow to consumer of any product in the world. And the other thing I'd like to point out is that of those 133 million dairy farms, the average farm size is 3 cows. So the dairy industry is one of those industries that really has a very broad base of smallholder farmers all over the world, some 37 million of those farms being led by women. So it's within that context that I share my thoughts with you today. And I guess after the world struggled for 2 years with the effects of COVID, many of us felt that 2022 was dawning with some optimism, but now I think we can all agree that this has been a devastating and harrowing year in terms of both the direct human toll of the war between Russia and Ukraine and also the indirect victims of that war, those families who depend on exports of food from those countries and who are now exposed to nutritional insecurity as a result. And the outlook, we believe, will continue to be bleak until the war ends, which is in the interests of all humanity. Trade essentially connects surpluses with deficits and help countries or regions to play to their strengths. A sustainable food system uses natural resources as efficiently and as effectively as possible. In the face of the dual challenges of feeding a growing world population and mitigating climate change, we need to continue to produce more from less with fewer adverse impacts and in places and in climates best adapted for this. As such, there can be no food security without open, rules-based trade. And while trade generates emissions which must be minimized, these pale in comparison to the differences between efficient and inefficient production or processing operations. So over the past 3 years, COVID, war, and increasing climatic events have convinced us that the dairy sector, like all agricultural commodities, must and can do more to improve its systems and operations to be as efficient as possible, to lower impacts on the environment and address climate change, which might further exacerbate food insecurity. In that realm, I'm going to talk about the work we're doing in the dairy sector. I'm going to focus in on Lloyd, and other speakers have covered off some of the trade barriers, particularly as relate to impacts from the war. But I'm going to talk more now about what's going on in the climate space, if I may. And so over the last few years, I'm pleased to report some positive developments from the dairy sector. And I'm talking specifically on behalf of the Global Dairy Platform, which represents many of the world's largest dairy companies, associations, scientific bodies, and other partners from around the world. The good news, I guess, is that the dairy sector is committed to net zero emissions by 2050, while at the same time ensuring future sustainable supply of nutritious dairy foods, contributing to zero hunger and ending poverty. At the core of the dairy sector efforts is the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero initiative. It's a global multi-stakeholder engagement that demonstrates that agriculture, livestock, and dairy can be part of the solution to climate change, while continuing to deliver high-quality nutrition and provide livelihoods and opportunities for billions of people around the world. Pathways to Dairy Net Zero is an initiative to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Dairy is responsible for 2.5% of the world's emissions, and 60% of our emissions are methane. And while work on greenhouse gas emissions is well advanced in developed economies, some 80% of the emissions from dairy come from the developing world. Working with the Global Methane Pledge, we identified 10 emerging countries that between them account for some 30% of all dairy emissions. During COP27, where I was with Lloyd and various others on this panel, the Green Climate Fund announced that in partnership with the International Fund for Agricultural Development, the Food and Agricultural Organization, ourselves, Global Dairy Platform, Global Methane Hub, and others, they approved 3.5 million of project preparation funding with the objective of leveraging 400 million in financing that will help transition dairy systems to lower emission, climate resilient pathways in East Africa, covering Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda. In addition, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Colombia, Pakistan, and Vietnam are all now preparing similar programs through a partnership with Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. I guess in conclusion for me, while industry can do its part, we encourage multilateral bodies such as WTO and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to produce rules and standards based upon scientific evidence that promote the most efficient flow of food products, vital for addressing food security, especially in consideration of the key role that net exporters of food, such as those in the dairy sector, play in delivering food security. And with that, Hassan, I hand back.
Well, thank you very much, Donald, for those insights. And we'll move next to our next speaker, Rick White, Rick, the crisis in the Black Sea region has created a serious problem for oilseeds, of which Ukraine was a key exporter. In fact, in 2020, Ukraine exported $5 billion worth of seed oils, making it the first largest exporter of these oils worldwide. How has the conflict impacted oilseed markets and canola more specifically?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Hassan, and hello to fellow panelists, and thank you to the WTO for organizing this event. It's very important. The crisis in the Black Sea certainly added to the ongoing COVID-19 related challenges and supply chain disruptions and created significant uncertainty around the world. Farmers as far away as the Canadian prairies, we faced increased fertilizer costs. There were supply chain pressures in getting the inputs and machinery parts needed for the 2022 production and in marketing products in a timely fashion. And add to all that, certainly a lot of price volatility as well. The fertilizer impact was particularly acute for the areas of the world that depend on imports and where imports of fertilizer, that is, and where trade barriers such as sanctions or export restrictions occurred, that certainly impeded movement and increased cost to farmers. An example of that is Canada ourselves. Sanctions imposed a 35% tariff on imported fertilizer from Russia. The conflict accentuated an already short supply of canola globally, and widespread drought on the Canadian prairies cut Canadian production by over 40%, resulting in Canada's lowest canola production since 2007. That created significant supply challenges and rationing of demand for the product. The end impact on canola supplies was actually quite minimal. For rapeseed and canola, the initial concern was Ukraine's ability to export their existing crop and the status of the crop that was still out in the field, which was planted in the fall of 2021. Whether farmers could access the inputs and particularly seed required to realize potential yields, such as fuel or fertilizer, or could get on their fields to harvest, were largely unknown and contributed to uncertainty and risk and again, price volatility in global oilseed markets. In the end, the resilience of Ukrainian farmers and high-level global efforts on grain movement prevailed, and canola was exported, and supply shortages were offset by increases in production elsewhere. The impact specifically on sunflower supplies was more pronounced with a different seeding time than canola. The canola there is seeded in the winter and there are sunflowers in the spring. So the initial concern was whether farmers would overcome conflict-related challenges and actually plant a crop. While there were reports that Ukraine should remain a leading exporter, sunflower seed production and that is estimated to have dropped significantly from 17.5 million metric tons in 2021-22 to 10.1 million in 22-23. But under the Black Sea Grain Initiative, exports of oil and meal continued, but less than pre-invasion. Questions related to Ukraine's production capacity and availability of supply will persist in 2023, and keeping export routes open and remains key so Ukraine can demand or can remain a global oilseeds supplier. And more largely, farmers globally need access to seed and fertilizer and other key crop inputs without delay, and added cost to grow and achieve the desired yields. The supply impact may soften in 2023 as markets have had time to absorb the impact and adjust accordingly. But as sunflower seed oil is part of the larger veg oil complex, substitutes do exist, and supply chains and ingredient formulations may have found alternate solutions. All in all, a lot of disruption, continued disruption. I'll maybe leave it at that and make some further points in the next round, Hassan. So back to you.
Many thanks, Rick, and certainly we'll come back to you in the second round. Let's turn to our last speaker, Ms. Lucy Muchoki. Lucy, we often hear that one of the regions that has been most impacted by the fertilizer shortage is Africa. How is the fertilizer crisis playing out amongst your constituency?
Thank you. And distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, from wherever you are. It's my great pleasure to be with you in this important discussion. Particularly, I'm very happy that Africa is on the table, and so more that it is about our SMEs. I've said once again and time again that our SMEs is the future for Africa. That's where we expect the transformation for Africa to take place, and that the constituents that I represent. I'm happy as one of the SME to be on this table. Majority of African businesses, as mentioned, SME, are scattered all over the world, I mean, in their countries, in their regions, making it very difficult for them to access various important facilities like technologies, information, infrastructure. And one of the worst one is the finance and credit because of their nature. And not forgetting, they have this an unassured market. Africa continues to import its food. As of today, according to the World Bank, Africa is importing that $5 billion worth of its food. Yet we say that Africa has the largest land remaining, as the arable land, which is at 60%. However, despite all these, the farm inputs have been one of the biggest challenges in the way we do our production. And that is one of the main challenges when it comes to us importing the food as we are doing today. We all know that the disruption caused by COVID hit Africa quite heavily. We know that there was this limitation of movement, and majority of our SMEs were really affected by these. The fact that they could not take the commodities for trade from one different station to the other really affected the businesses, as well as the consumption of food was at minimum, such that the nutrition component of food was lacking in majority of the food that was distributed at that time. Again, Africa continued facing a critical climatical crisis. In East Africa, as we speak currently, we have the drought, and this is effect of the climatical change. And furthermore, comes now the Ukraine-Russian war. This has really had a heavy impact in Africa. Not forgetting that 80% of our farm fertilizer, the input, is imported from these countries and others. Africa for the longest has not been able to be food secure. The distribution of fertilizer is usually undertaken by the governments, who are not, or occasionally rather, they don't send the fertilizer to the farmers when it is required. And there's been a push by the Africans, the private sector, talking to the government, privatization of the distribution of the fertilizer. This is an area where the SMEs are playing a critical role. And we want to understand how much more the policies can be undertaken, this policy change can be undertaken in Africa. Already we have in Nigeria, the distribution of fertilizers by the private sector, and there's SMEs without the government using what they call the e-wallet. Now, what currently the productivity for African for production has really gone down. In some countries like Cameroon, we are seeing a production effect almost at 50%. This is really serious and need a lot of thinking and a lot of focus and coming up with solutions that can be able to assist these kind of scenarios, knowing that we are still food insecure. We are seeing a country like Ghana having less than 30% reduction in the purchase of fertilizer, leading to more than 30 million metric tons of food required. This in itself, not only the farmer who is suffering, not only the people who are suffering, the businesses also are feeling the pinch, not forgetting that the prices are becoming unbearable, leading to high cost of produce and commodities across the continent. I would like to suggest that we as Africans must address these issues, not forgetting that Africa still needs to not only be food secure, but Africa also need to ensure that its people are able to access food that is nutritious. Currently, we know that governments are trying in ways possible to subsidize their food, of their fertilizer, so that we can be able to get it to the farmers at an affordable price. Of course, this is not a sustainable model, but I believe that it can work, it's working, but not as it should be. For instance, in Kenya, we saw the government intervening and sending a subsidy program for about 114 KT of fertilizer, but it does not mean that the fertilizer reached the farmers at the right time, leading us to more doubts on whether we are going to still achieve food security. Not forgetting that the prices going higher is also becoming the most difficult time. There are few interventions that I would like to consider or discuss with you here that Africans should be able to adapt. First, these temporary subsidies. The government could step in with temporary subsidies to stimulate procurement from global supplies outside Eastern Europe. Just like Kenya is trying to do. Kenya has followed this route by buying fertilizer at a high cost on the global market and then subsidizing the cost for farmers locally. Tanzania is also considering adding subsidies as a feature of the bulk procurement system. Financing. The importers in sub-Saharan Africa are reporting that financing is currently the biggest barrier. In 2021, that KT urea vessel cost £9 million. This year, the cost is 3 or 4 times that amount. This year, this level are unable to match the cost and have had to be creative to keep the businesses alive. For example, importing smaller quantities of fertilizer at a higher price. So something really definitely need to be done on the issue of financing so that we can have affordable fertilizer for our farmers and distribution by our SMEs. Tracking market dynamics. Closely tracking market dynamics, including price and availability, can help inform policy and business decision. We encourage all stakeholders to reference the VFA dashboards to inform interventions across sub-Saharan Africa. Investing in production capacity. In the mid to long term, investing heavily in production capacity domestically or the intra-African level could insulate sub-Saharan Africa from future risks associated with the net importers. Nutrients use efficiency, identifying ways to prioritize fertilizer use for the crop value chains with the highest return on investment for farmers. A massive farmer awareness campaign and support to farmers, organizations doing research could be beneficial. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for those insights. Very useful. Panelists, I think we'll now move to the second round of questions. And here I will have to urge all of you to be as concise as possible and limit your intervention so that we'll have time to take listener questions at the end. We have quite a lot of questions that have already come in. So please be concise in this second round of questions. So here I would like us to focus specifically on international trade, and I'll go to Lloyd to start with you. Turns inwards as a result of this crisis through the onshoring of food production and the building of domestic food reserves. Are you seeing some of this in South America, and how might this impact global food security?
Well, thanks, Hassan. That's certainly a concern that we've all had, especially when this crisis came to place and the natural reaction by a lot of countries. But I don't think this will happen. I think the global trading system is resilient, robust, and functioning, despite what a lot of critics say. Supply chains will adjust to the factors of supply and demand, and trade will continue to grow. Just look at what happened with China, despite the initial shocks due to the trade war and geopolitical actions by governments. Trade is again booming by those countries that were having the trade wars against each other. Brazil took up some of that market slack, and they're going to continue to grow as they expand their production in order to meet demand. So despite the important roles, though, that agri-food trade plays in the regions, it's not without challenges. And thanks to the concentration of destination of exported products, this limits inter-regional trade. And so that's something we're working on at IICA with our member countries to try to help facilitate the diversification of markets. I know that the soybean industry in my country, the United States, for instance, with the trade war that happened a couple of years ago, one of the things that they try to do is to diversify and not put all their eggs in one basket, as the expression goes. And so that's something that we're working on both in terms of export as well as with inter-regional trade. Inter-regional trade is something that we're lacking in a lot of our big regional areas. And so that's something where we look at the North American market, and Ricardo knows this full well. It's been a huge success, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which now goes by another name, the USMCA, and another name in Spanish and French. But that has shown that, breaking down barriers in a region can really foster interregional trade. And so we're trying to do that within the different regions of our member countries, as well as with international partners around the world. There's also the issue of strengthening the role of food security and the transformation of food systems that have been discussed in the UN Food Systems Summit. The multilateral trading system is a huge and important part of that, so that we use agreements to strengthen this kind of trade. As I mentioned in the previous response, free trade is a principal component of global food security. Trade promotes more effective use of scarce and limited global food production resources that Donald discussed, such as arable land, water, and labor. Increased nationalism erects barriers and reduces trade flows, causing inefficiency and greatly increasing global food insecurity. So this notion of nationalism and turning inwards is absolutely the wrong approach. We know that already. And so what the WTO Secretary General has been, or Director General, Dr. Ngozi, has been vehemently stressing is the importance of re-globalization in the context of this inward turning. So we support that, and we think it's very important. And then finally, in terms of agriculture, the advent of new precision and smart farming technologies, life sciences innovations, and other technological and scientific advances are going to transform the world's ability to feed its growing population while using less inputs and resources. And this is vital. These new innovations must be disseminated widely to the smallholders that Lucy talked about in Africa, and they need to be adopted globally. And unscientific trade barriers that are being erected by nationalism, by ideology, and sometimes by just misguided intentions of perceived consumer interests will always hurt the most vulnerable, which is the exact opposite of the sometimes good intentions of misguided policies. I've been talking a lot in the last year about two people, Henry Wallace and Norman Borlaug. Because 100 years ago in the United States, farming was subsistence farming. But there were three innovations that transformed agriculture. That was fertilizer, hybrid corn, which came from Henry Wallace, and the tractor. The same thing is happening today with innovation in agriculture, with digital technology, with life sciences technology, with precision technology in water and inputs and everything else, drone technology. It's an exciting time. We need to embrace these changes, because these changes are going to make us farm more efficiently. They're going to contribute to the kind of climate goals that Donald was talking about earlier in the dairy sector, but across many different sectors. And so it's an exciting time if we work globally and not erect the type of inward thinking that I know is natural for governments and politicians to react to, but it has the absolute opposite effect of what's intended. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, Lloyd, for those insights. And I'll turn now to Rick. As a former chair of the International Agri-Food Network, what are the main disruptions to global agricultural value chains that you have seen during COVID and the war? In other words, what are the main barriers to agricultural trade that you see today?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and certainly agree with a lot of what Lloyd was talking about just now. The pandemic and conflict emphasized the importance of international trade to global food supply and security, and of trade facilitative solutions to ensure food and inputs can move from point A to point B. And it has certainly tested our resilience and highlighted the precarious balance between safeguarding our ability to grow and supply food with managing increased volatility and climate challenges. Trade is too often taken for granted, but it does play a critical role in food security. It provides food for 1 in every 6 people around the world, ensuring that food and other essential goods such as fertilizer and crop inputs get to where they are needed. COVID and the war has accelerated an existing trend away from our global international trading system and rules of trade to more national populist policies. Now, the inward focus has resulted in a growth of technical and non-technical barriers to trade, which increases risks and costs. The WTO framework and rules of trade underpins international trade, providing much needed certainty, reducing risk, and striving towards a more level playing field. And modernization of the WTO and renewal of the agreement on agriculture should remain a global priority. It would help ensure our rules of trade reflect today's trading system and would serve to enhance trust in the global framework. Farmers, exporters face a patchwork of regulations and standards for plant and animal health and food safety, increasing production and market risk, and preventing companies from simply pivoting between markets and responding to evolving food demand. For example, products enhanced by agricultural biotechnology, such as soybeans and corn and canola, or grown using crop protection products, often require individual country approvals. So to enable market access, trade facilitative solutions for agricultural biotech and MRLs for crop protection products would reduce risk and strengthen food trade. Multilateral institutions such as the WTO and Codex Alimentarius have an increasingly important role to play in all of this. And, COVID standards provides consistent multilateral rules upholding food safety and facilitating trade. COVID and the war resulted in an increased focus on resilient food systems and supply chains. Disruptive events, both avoidable and unavoidable, will continue to test supply chains and impact global regional trade. The challenges are complex and varied and not solved overnight. Through this, we're seeing an emphasis on local, urban, and peri-urban food systems to strengthen food sovereignty and address perceived risks associated with so-called long supply chains and the climate impact of transporting goods over long distances. On a macro level, the state of the economy will continue to impact agricultural trade. Rising interest rates, economic slowdown, currency fluctuations all increase the cost of production and food and impact consumers' ability to purchase adequate levels of healthy and nutritious food. And one last point I'd like to make, Hassan, is that we are increasingly observing an intersection between trade and climate. Approaches to sustainability should respect different contexts, regions, farms, and business types, and sizes and practices. It should not act as a barrier to trade, and it should be based on science and evidence-based decision-making. Thank you. Back to you, Hassan.
Thank you very much, Rick, for those insights. And we'll turn now to Lucy. Lucy, what are the main barriers to trade that the agribusinesses that you represent currently face? And how will the African Continental Free Trade Agreement succeed in addressing some of these barriers within Africa?
Thank you. Definitely Africa, as it is today, the issue of intertrade among ourselves has been almost impossible. The movement of people being restricted. And of course, sharing of information from different countries on what they grow and what we can work together to develop and manufacture our products has been almost at zero. Africa has continued to export most of its raw materials and hence fetching very little as compared if they were adding value to their produce. The African SME, as I mentioned, is a constituent that I represent, has a very always challenged with different issues like access of information, access of technologies, access of finance, and access of markets, which all will be addressed by AFCFTA, that is African Continental Free Trade. When we look at the US, we see their trading stands at 50% among themselves. Asia stands at 60%, Europe stands at 70%. And we ask ourselves why Africa, we continue with 12%. With AFCFTA, Africa Free Continental Trade Area, we expect to address these issues. And I'm certain that we'll be able to see the numbers rising quite fast. We are looking like for agriculture, we expect more than 750 billion US dollars worth of trade between ourselves. And this will make the numbers rise quite fast. When I look at the issues to do with SMEs, the way I mentioned in my beginning, when I was beginning my speech, being scattered everywhere and with very little access of infrastructure. Under the AFCFTA, that's African Continental Free Trade Area, we expect the African government to support either through private means, the private companies, or through the government initiative to develop the special economic zones. This will enable our small SMEs to access this infrastructure where they can be able to access technologies easily and innovations, and also they can be able to get information that they require as they plan their businesses and the production in our continent. So indeed, we are looking at the various issues that have been the biggest nightmare to Africa being solved through the AFCFTA. And this, obviously, when we sat down as Africans, we knew that time is now. So indeed, we believe that we shall be able to achieve more products, markets, which are value added as opposed to what we have done in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy, for that insights on the impact of the AFCFTA. Let me turn now to Donald. Donald, product standards, inspection, and conformity assessment requirements can represent major challenges for the dairy sector, in addition to the calls for greater environmental sustainability. So where would you say that the world needs to do better to facilitate the trade in dairy?
Yeah, thank you, Hassan. And I think Rick and Lloyd and Lucy have all pointed out to us the role that trade and domestic production play in improving global food security and nutrition. And that reaffirms the importance of not imposing export prohibitions or restrictions. But I guess in difficult times, some countries may still want to fall back on policies that are restrictive in attempts to protect their sectors or industries or promote environmental objectives. I'd urge countries to follow science-based policies and harmonize practices promoted by the WTO and, as Rick said, by the Codex Alimentarius that facilitate unrestricted trade. It's worth reminding us all that international trade allows for food production to be most efficient according to the national context, thereby optimizing environmental impacts, combating climate change, and making food more affordable. For example, production of dairy occurs most efficiently in temperate zones, where dairy cattle thrive on grasslands, and in lower heat zones. As a result, there are efficiencies in overall production that can occur, especially when dairy is traded in places where it has an optimal production system to other places where dairy needs extra resources. You've asked what the world can do to better facilitate trade in dairy. I would urge greater alignment with countries with the Codex standards for greater market access, eliminating market access barriers that are detrimental to trade and promote food insecurity. As the most important international standard-setting body in food safety, the Codex Alimentarius plays a crucial role in protecting the health of consumers while enabling fair trade of agricultural products to the benefit of farmers and consumers. A fully functioning, adequately financed global Codex standard-setting body would significantly facilitate trade and make it easier for growers, especially in emerging markets, and exporters to produce compliant foodstuffs and to avoid market risks. If I may, I'd like to comment briefly on this concept of turning inward, and I think we've tended to focus mostly on turning inward on production. But one of the things that concerns me is trade is dependent upon supply, and we're starting to see governments in some more developed countries try and address their commitments under the Paris Agreement by reducing the production of export foodstuffs. And I would encourage all governments to think about environmental policies. They must consider the issue of global mass balance. We can't solve climate change, global emissions, and nutritional requirements by only considering issues within national boundaries. This is a global challenge, and too many countries are now trying to solve for their emissions without considering the knock-on effects of the countries that would import those foodstuffs from them. Issues such as nutritional security, conflict, migration, and ultimately leakage in GHG emissions, where countries start to produce more in an environment that is less suitable for that production. And with that, Hassan, I will hand back.
Thank you very much, Donald. And let's turn now to Ricardo. Ricardo, if you were given the opportunity to rewrite the WTO rulebook on agriculture, what priority changes would you make? You're muted, Ricardo.
Sorry, okay, there I am. Thank you. And while being member of the International Grain Trade Coalition and of its Management Council, designated as representative for North and Central America, we are aligned with the principles and policy lines for the international trade of agricultural bulk products. And in Mexico, we are recipients of the fundamentals on domestic sectorial policies as member of the National Agricultural Council. Furthermore, giving an adverse view, I must mention our conception for a tropicalized trade and food policy system altogether has as background WTO's related documents, such as facilitating trade through international regulatory cooperation, the case of TBT, SPS agreements and committees, and much more recently and updated with current multilateral framework inputs, the SPS declaration for the 12th WTO's Ministerial Conference, responding to modern SPS challenges. In both of those sources remains the same spirit of cooperation for a common understanding and fair relationship, a science and risk-based rationale as an impartial site, and to procure transparency for everyone's policy decision-making practices and systems. We propose from all of those perspectives a diverse and complementary national policy making for production and commercialization systems without exclusions, with measurable goals and results, subject to a set of international referential indicators, and even building a compound score of compliance with them, oriented for first, sustainability and public health protection, developing any of agroecological models, or applying specialized and intensive technologies, or several mixtures of both, such as the conservation agriculture, all of them with the aim to preserve the hydraulic and soil resources, the ecosystems and their biological diversity, and reduce the carbon footprint within their own harmonized platforms, frameworks, and emphasizing the international established standards for food safety and security measures with safety capacity building in the agricultural production practices. The inclusion of small and medium farmers with equity and intrinsic participation of gender, indigenous people and local communities, according to their own informed and free decisions within national legislations and under their sociocultural characteristics and current capacities and potentials. That's in comprehensive development packages, combining circular economies with regional exchange, and, of course, an open, facilitated, and equitable foreign trade, which should comply with the rules nationally committed as parties to multilateral, regional, and bilateral agreements. Address, and that's the last part that we are targeting for, is to address the national agricultural productivity and production with necessary transfers for the entire range of primary operators, in particular, procuring together with their downstream trade and supply and value chains, the food security and rural economic growth in each country, with a strategic and viable degree of self-sufficiency in staple foods, where and if possible, and adapting the set continuously to the characteristics, structures, situation, and trends of the national and global agricultural products markets, in order to build in this way and with all of the above, a consistent resilience of agri-food systems in an integrated and adapted way according to each case. As you may have been aware, this set of proposals and features are not quite innovative and keep an underlying relationship with the first question on the Mexican self-sufficiency and inflation control policies. Herein, our purpose is to manage the existing and key frameworks and tools, integrating them into flexible and objective basis for achieving the wide spectrum of described targets, which for the Mexican case appear at reach. That's my intervention for the moment.
Thank you, Ricardo, for those concrete ideas. John, let me now come back to you. Many barriers to trade have been identified by panelists in this second segment. And do you think the WTO is capable of addressing them, and how? Can you also brief us on how the ongoing agricultural negotiations in the WTO could contribute to a stronger trading environment?
Absolutely. But let me first say I very much agree and share the views of the other panelists, especially what Lloyd has said about the importance of science, innovation, etc., in improving productivity. On Donald's call for multilateralization and Lewis's very good argument that the completion of the African continental FTA is going to make a big difference when it comes to African value added. But no, on your question, it's very clear, and I'm very critical of the WTO, it has not kept pace with the challenges that we're discussing or developments in global markets. The current rule book, frankly, is not fit for purpose. And also the rules are less enforceable than they used to be because of what one major member of the WTO has asphyxiated the dispute settlement system. So we cannot enforce the rules we have. So there's a really urgent need to update the rule book to tackle the challenges that we've been discussing this morning. We need a new approach, a repurposing of the reform of agriculture, integrating into that these issues of food security, the environment, climate, poverty, and sustainability. Now, there are three specific areas where I think we can do something in WTO in the short and medium term. The first would be to negotiate stronger rules on transparency, so that we actually know what's happening in terms of agricultural markets, trade flows, food aid, trade restrictions on food, and subsidies. All of these areas are linked to the current food security crisis. Secondly, we discussed this quite a lot this morning, we need stronger disciplines on to prevent export restrictions. And thirdly, more for the medium term, I think, we need to reduce trade distorting agricultural subsidies. We've seen a big rise in those subsidies in the last 7 or 8 years, and we need to continue the reform process away from that trade distorting support, which has also a very damaging environmental impact. It's generally accepted that trade distorting subsidies are bad for sustainable production. Now, we need to be realistic, but I think reform of subsidies is possible, provided that all of the major subsidizers are ready to engage and contribute. And that includes not only the EU, and we are ready to do that, and we've always been ready, but also China, India, and the United States. Unfortunately, at MC12, those countries were sufficiently content with the status quo that they were not willing to negotiate subsidy reform. It should not be impossible in the future. We were able in 2015 to eliminate completely, or almost completely, highly distorting export subsidies. In 2000, countries were spending 7 billion euros a year in export subsidies. Now it's gone down to 12 million. So it can be done. And we can do the same thing with domestic support over time. It needs two things. First of all, as I said, a repurposing of the negotiations in WTO to integrate the drivers of food security and sustainability. And secondly, it needs a top-down commitment by heads of state and government to tell their negotiators to actually get real and negotiate subsidy reform in the WTO for the greater global benefit.
Thank you, John, for those reflections. A lot of food for thought. And let's turn now to the listener questions that we have received from viewers all over the world. I'll ask each of you to be very brief in your responses and not take maximum 2 minutes to respond. John, actually, there's a question here from a viewer in Geneva, and it asks, what can the EU do to lead by example in unblocking WTO agriculture negotiations? Can the EU offer some unilateral reforms to show the way and sort of lead? I guess that's what the viewer is insinuating.
Well, we have been leading it by example. I'll give you two important examples. First of all, over the last couple of decades, we have comprehensively reformed our agricultural subsidies. So we don't do trade distorting support. Other countries have gone in the other direction: India, China, the USA, masses of distorting subsidies. But the example that we're giving is that reduction of support has actually been beneficial for both for productivity and for the environment. We are the only major agricultural region in the world which, in the last 30 years, in parallel with this removal of distorting support, we're the only region which has both increased productivity while decreasing considerably greenhouse gas emissions. So I think, at least when it comes to subsidy reform, we can demonstrate the benefits of our own example. And secondly, and more recently, we have just tabled in the WTO some proposals in the Agriculture Committee on transparency, how to have more transparency about subsidies, export restrictions, food aid transfers, etc. We're proposing specific disciplines to make export restrictions much more difficult to impose. Rick White talked about populist national policies, and I think it's exactly that we want to try to target, to prevent export restrictions driven by populist national policies. And thirdly, we are making the argument in the WTO that we need to look seriously now at reforming trade distorting agricultural subsidies, which, as I said, are going in the wrong direction. So the EU is doing all it can. We are a necessary but not sufficient member of the WTO. It needs other countries to participate and engage in these negotiations. We can't do it alone. And I hope that there will be a change of mindset in the next 2 or 3 years amongst the other major players in the WTO, because of the urgency and the crisis that we are all collectively facing.
Thank you, John, for that response and for providing insights as to some of the steps the EU is undertaking in the WTO. Lloyd, we have a question from a viewer from Brazil. It asks, what is the Inter-American Institute doing to elevate the shortage of fertilizers?
Thanks, Hassan, for your question. We've been working with the government with Brazil. We've been working with all member states to find ways in which we can work together to highlight this issue and to find ways in which we can, increase the production of fertilizer within, this part of the world. As other panels have discussed earlier, it's not a quick fix. This is something that is going to require years of work and investment by the private sector and by governments in order to help increase the capacity to have fertilizer in countries like Canada be able to meet the demand of countries like Brazil. Some of that has happened, and Brazil did a good job of working to get an adequate fertilizer supply so that it can maintain production. We're a little worried about production in 2023, in which farmers are not putting as much fertilizers in the field because of the prices, and that's going to perhaps impact yield, and that could actually make the food security crisis grow in the future. So it's not a quick fix. It's a long-term investment by governments, as well as enabling the private sector to invest in their area. And at the end of the day, we all hope that there can be some resolution to this conflict in the Black Sea area, so that world trade can return to normal. It's unbelievable to me that we've returned to this type of geopolitical atmosphere when the world had advanced so much since the end of the Cold War. But here we are. I think the commitment by governments, as John just articulated, to this multilateral trading system and to improving it is part of the key to that. And then the other geopolitical factors will have to sort out themselves. But getting the commitment by governments around the world to focus on a robust multilateral trading system that can adjust to shortages, to supply and demand, to weather situations, and even to conflict, it is vital. And so we're working very closely within our member states, but also as a bridge to other parts of the world, including Africa, Lucy, where we've engaged in high-level ministerial dialogues with the African continent, particularly through AGRA, but also through other associations in Africa, because we see a great deal of potential for the type of north-south, south-south collaboration that can increase the productivity of the African region, which we think is vital for the sake of food security in the world in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd, for your response. Ricardo, I have a question here from a viewer from Mexico. And the viewer asked whether the revised NAFTA, the USMCA, is useful for Mexican farmers, and has any real and meaningful changes been made to the agreement. So the USMCA is what the viewer is referring to, and whether you have seen any real and meaningful changes from NAFTA.
For sure, and those changes are beneficial since our point of view, in terms of having more, you can say, advanced system in terms of, you can say, equitable relationship between in our case for importing and also for exporting our products, our agricultural products, and that we have already put in force some of them. Of course, there is it was firstly separated, the sanitary and phytosanitary standards chapter, for example, and we have a very you can say more accurate precisions in this case for the agricultural trade. And that means that we have a wider set of references and rules that must be also complied, and that will be and are being observed, by the way, and naturally that will give us some time to accommodate or to adapt to those kind of compromises, which we are now on that term trying to provide. And one example of that could be the electronic certification for phytosanitary purposes for shipments exported and imported between Mexico and the United States. Canada will be adapting later this system, but this was one of the items that was anticipated and promoted in the USMCA, and now we are seeing it operating and having and giving a more efficient operation for the agricultural trade between the countries. That's only one example of what can be achieved with this also, and what is anticipated also, continuous improvements of the agreements in the several, well, in established periods that will be revised, and we think it will be enhanced in each of those revisions. So that's our perspective in the effects of the USMCA over the agricultural trade in the North American region.
Thank you, Ricardo, for your response. Donald, I have a question here from Geneva, and it asks, what steps is the dairy sector taking to reduce its environmental footprint worldwide? Livestock is a major emitter of methane.
Sure, and I think I covered some of this during my earlier intervention. We have a global program, Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. There are now over 150 groups signed on to that, including governments, major dairy companies, smallholder farmers all over the world. They represent between the 150, so they represent well over 40% of the world's dairy supply, who have now made commitments to tackling this challenge of climate change. Livestock is responsible for 14.5% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And as I mentioned earlier, dairy is responsible for 2.5%, of which about 60% is methane, a short-lived gas. And so we have a very active program looking at how we can reduce methane globally in the dairy sector. The other thing we recognize is that 80% of emissions from the dairy sector are coming from emerging or developing economies. So as a dairy sector, we have a strategy in place to access the financing that is required for the transformation of the dairy sector in those emerging markets. And I mentioned before the work we're doing with the Green Climate Fund, with IFAD, FAO and others. So at the same time as we're lifting the floor, if I can put it that way, we also have quite an active collaboration on pushing the ceiling. What can we collaboratively do with major dairy regions around the world to advance and accelerate advance and accelerate the research and the implementation of technologies and knowledge in all regions in the world. In the interest of time, Hassan, I will pass back.
Thank you, Donald, and thank you for that comprehensive response. Let's turn now to Rick. There's a question here from Rome. Should a private sector mechanism like one that exists in Rome be created in WTO for more regular interaction with businesses?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm not so fussy about the actual mechanism. I mean, I think the concept would be that, yes, the private sector should be there and consulted and work very closely with WTO in any changes to the system, because it is the private sector that uses those rules. It is the private sector that is trying to move product across borders, and the private sector certainly needs to be there. In what form, I don't know. There's many different ways of doing that, but it's extremely important. That's where the rubber hits the road, and that's the best way of trying to get it right. When we look at modernization of WTO, just to elaborate, we're looking for more transparency. We're looking for a restored dispute settlement function and solutions to address trade distorting agricultural subsidies. So not a lot of movement on the agriculture package, but certainly on those issues and topics, the private sector who uses these rules certainly needs to be at the table and providing direct advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Let's turn now to our last question here, which is to Lucy, and it's a question from a viewer from Senegal. And it asks, is Africa still suffering from the invasion of locusts? And what are the other problems specific to African agriculture that the rest of the world is not seeing?
Thank you for that. I think right now, the locusts, especially which was witnessed in the Eastern African region, is being managed with a lot of support from FAO. And our scientists, actually, it's just last week when I was watching the new research undertaken by CGR centers in addressing the locusts. And I'm glad that there are some solutions and things are starting to take a better shape, and definitely the issue of locusts will be handled, and it is being handled well. So far, so good. When it comes to the issues of how many other problems we have as Africans in agriculture, well, there are quite a number. And some of them I've mentioned, including the government, the policymakers being quite on holding on to so many activities that should actually be handled by the private sector. Of course, the issue of standards and the issue of capacity is very, very key to us as Africans. And the fact that we have continued working and exporting our produce to other countries in the Europe and to other parts of the world, unfinished. But I'm certain we focus on very clear model of how do we improve our exports, finished goods, that is value addition, and how can the WTO support us in this particular way, in the sense that we are always underprivileged as Africans because of lack of capacity. But in other words, we still also want to welcome different investors and partnership across the globe to work with them and ensure that we are able to catch up and be able to support the standards of our foods and be able to access more markets, not just within ourselves, but across the globe. But one thing that is very, very critical is lack of technology. We have really, and again, I also said lack of finance, the credit, affordable, not just the finance that is available. One thing I noted, and I'm very proud of the kind of arrangements that are coming under the AFCFTA, that's African Free Continental Trade, is like the AFDB Bank coming up with the wholesale credit guarantee, which will see AFDB Bank guarantee more than 80% of the total amount to be used. This to me is some of the key moves that Africans are making to change the whole challenges that they face, that is in terms of guaranteeing our SMEs and other farmers in terms of accessing finance, which has been a very big hindrance in doing business. I like the idea that we are open as a continent to work with partners to access the latest technologies so that we can be able to develop much better. And more so, climate change is real. So we are also really working hand in hand to ensure that we are able to work with other countries who are ahead of us in terms of minimizing or mitigating the climate change effects. So I'm seeing a lot of green technologies being adopted by our people across the continent. This is really key in moving forward. But again, we want to request that WTO address the issue we have always talked about, unfair trade between us and the larger part of the world. I'm sure this is something that has been discussed over and over again, but we still believe that we can still tackle this, and as a continent, we can be able to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy, for ending us on a very positive note. We only have 3 minutes until our allocated time is up. So I would just like to thank all the panelists for their insights, for their reflections, and for also answering all the listener questions. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, very enriching. I wish we had more time because certainly there's more questions coming in, but I think we'll have to stop here in the interest of time. But I'd just like to make an appeal to all viewers to stay with us for the closing session of the Agri-Food Business Day, which will start shortly at 2 p.m. So we have about an hour, 10-minute break before the closing session, whose link can be found on the WTO Agri-Food Business Day website. So thank you very much again to all the panelists and to all the viewers and to the WTO Secretariat for organizing this very important Agri-Food Business Day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.